Hello, you are listening to NPE Stories. This is a podcast where NPEs can share their story. I am your host, Lily, and I found out I was an NPE through an ancestry DNA test that changed my life forever. NPE is a term that stands for not parent expected or non-paternal event. This means that one or more of our parents are not who we believe them to be. NPE Stories is a podcast where NPEs can share their story of what their original family was like, how they found out they were an NPE, and what their journey has been like since the day they found out. And welcome to episode 27, where today I am talking to Travis. Hi, Travis.
Hi.
Thank you so much for doing this today.
Glad to do it, and excited that you have this venue to be able to help people that are going through this.
Yeah, great. Thank you. And I know we were just talking about how did you find this podcast? And you said you think maybe you saw it on a comment thread or someone talking about NPE podcasts, right?
Yeah, on one of the private Facebook groups, saw it on a comment and then went to search for it and found it, and have taken the time over the course of the last couple of months to listen to all of them. And it's been interesting for me to hear. Obviously, every story is unique and different, and we all have our own different ways we approach it, but there's so many common threads, I think, in this circumstance that it's always informative and educational for me to kind of see other people's perspective.
Oh, yeah, me too. I get so much out of listening to everyone's individual story. And today we're going to hear yours. So thank you for doing this. And if you're ready, let's go ahead and get you started from the beginning so we can find out a little bit more about your original family and what your childhood was like.
You bet. So I'm gonna tell the story, as if it was still true. That's the one interesting thing about this is your entire identity changes, and it almost is really hard to it's hard to convey to people because you've been telling your life story in a certain way, in my case, for 45 years. And when that changes, it's sometimes difficult to describe. So I'm going to try to speak to it as if it were still true and how I always would tell my story, which is that I was raised in a single by a single mother. And my brother and I have a brother who is about 3 years older than I. My parents divorced when I was about 9 months old, and I never knew my father. I met him once when I was about 10 years old. We grew up in a small town. We moved to another state whenever I was about 8.5 years old. And so I grew up really in two small towns in different states. Again, raised in by a single mother who struggled to be able to provide for her kids, her two boys. The interesting thing about my brother and I is that people would always remark about how we looked nothing alike. And the story always was that I look like my mom and he looks like our dad. And I have blonde hair and light skin, and my mom is fair and light skinned, and both have blue eyes, and my brother is dark hair and kind of olive, skin. And we would always, to the point that we would always joke about it, that we had, that we would joke about, that as we would introduce ourselves to people, if we were together, that the only thing we had in common was our hand size. And so we would show we had the same sized hands, but literally nothing else physically would you be able to tie us together in any way. And So it's kind of a running joke. And I would say my brother and I are very much different people from a character personality, from a characteristic or personality standpoint as well. We grew closer in adulthood, having a chance to uh, be roommates in college, and grew closer in adulthood. But as kids, we didn't really get along, didn't have the same interests. And I would say in a lot of ways that's still true. And so all growing up through my childhood, my mother struggled to be able to provide for us. She worked 2 and 3 jobs at different times to be able to support us. And having not had a father in my life, I didn't really know anything different. People would ask me as a teenager, what's it like not having a dad? I never really knew how to answer that question, and it almost never really even occurred to me. I just didn't know anything different. I didn't realize I was missing anything until probably my later teen years. I've always considered the job that she did to be pretty remarkable, and that my brother and I are very much maybe an exception to the norm for how what is often the case with those raised in a single parent home. My brother's a doctor. I've had a successful career in healthcare, and consider the job that she did to keep us focused and driven and all of that to be pretty remarkable. And yet, when I look back at my feelings all growing up were very much that I just felt like I was out of place. I lacked a lot of self confidence until my older teenage years. My personal faith, really played a large role in helping me with my self confidence. Um, but I did feel out of place all through it, really, in a lot of ways throughout my life. Just felt like there was a way that I just didn't belong. And even though in my mind, I was always told growing up again that I looked like my mother, um, and yet I didn't feel like I was anything like her. Um, and it was hard for me to sort of reconcile why I was the way I was. And My brother is very different from me, as I mentioned before, and just had a lot of kind of self doubt a little bit in a lot of ways. And in spite of that, I went on and have had a just a wonderfully blessed life, and have a beautiful, wonderful wife who's been very supportive through this entire process, and 4 wonderful kids. And that's a little bit about my childhood.
Well, it sounds like you and your brother turned out pretty great, and your mom did a good job with you guys.
She did. I think there's a lot to be said, which is part of what makes this situation really difficult. Because in some ways, some of the feelings that I'll describe, maybe later, that I have toward her are difficult to reconcile, because I have a lot of respect for her and the job that she did, and in raising us. So with the discovery, that's what was amazing with that, is immediately it just made sense. Some people talk about questioning it and calling up, whether it was Ancestry or whatever the tool was that they used, and I immediately knew it was true.
How did you find out you were an NPE?
So my wife had got me a 23andMe for Christmas, in Christmas of 2017. And I will say, just a few months before that, we moved to another state from where we were, had gotten a new job, and that Christmas, she bought me the 23andMe, and more for the health aspects to it. And she thought she knew that I would enjoy it and like it. And so I took it and got my results back, and everything was fine. I was more interested in the health and sort of the genetic history there of kind of where you come from. And I looked all at that. I spent a lot of time with it. And I would say who I understood to be my father, that side of the family didn't necessarily have a great reputation. And I wasn't really interested in kind of looking at family that you're related to. And I remember giving the permissions for that and kind of looking at it. And I wasn't that inquisitive about it. It didn't interest me all that much.
Mm-hmm.
And so I continued to access the app every now and then, just looking at updates that would happen with health history and all of that. And what I didn't know was my brother decided to do 23andMe as well that following summer, summer of 2018. And so it was actually 1 year to the day that we moved to the new state where we moved to, that he texted me and said, "Hey, I did 23andMe. I sent you a invite to connect, but I don't see our information, and do you know how to use this?" And so I quickly texted him back, and I was actually driving in my car. I can vividly remember this. Some things just get etched in your memory in very permanent ways, and this did. And so I texted him back as I was driving and said, "Hold on, yeah, I know how to use the app. I'll get in and walk you through it." And so I went into the app and I loaded it and did the DNA connections, and I see him there, and I open it up, and it says that our predicted genetic relationship is half brother. And I immediately texted him back and said, "Hey, I think this says we have different fathers. Can you talk?"
Oh.
And um, I was just actually coming home. I was pulling into my driveway and into the garage, and at the same time as I was texting him and kind of waiting for his response back before I would call him. And my wife was home, and so she was there, and I said, "Look at this." And we were talking, back and forth, my wife and I, and how I described a few minutes ago, I never questioned it. It I immediately told my wife, I said, this just makes sense. It makes sense of my life.
Mm-hmm.
And it was almost happy and gratifying in a way, is how I would describe it. Um, and and I will say my initial reaction was much more of a kind of a happy feeling to some extent, and that might not be the right word exactly, but it was not devastating news for me.
Okay.
Um, it made sense. So I got on the phone with my brother, and we started talking, and I think we both, I try to use humor to kind of diffuse situations, and thankfully he and I have a close enough relationship that I mentioned earlier that he and I didn't really get along until our later years in life, in adulthood, and when we both had families, and we've really have grown close. But one of the first things he said to me within 5 minutes of our conversation is he said, "Wow, I always knew you were a bastard." And and we just laughed out loud, Lily. Like, it was I'm describing that. Everybody reacts differently to this. And so what I'm saying is my reaction was I was not devastated. It just was like it made sense.
Yeah.
It was sort of a relief in a way. And he said that, and I laughed, and I thought it was funny.
Yeah.
And I still think it's funny. It was, but of course, when that sort of emotion wears off, um, it started to become more real,
Mm-hmm.
as far as what this meant. And I went through 8 days, and I realized this is a blessing. And by the way I would describe my entire situation is challenging as it continues to be in a lot of different ways. My outcome is has been a blessing in so many different ways for me. Just the knowledge and awareness of it has been a blessing for me. But 8 days, and so I recognize that a lot of people, their parent, or they can't find who their biological father is, and I, I should and do feel blessed that it was only 8 days, but for 8 days I didn't know who my father was, and my brother and I went back and forth all week long. Who was around us as kids, just trying to think of who it might be, and we kept, just kind of thinking of different scenarios and possibilities, and to the point where I was just starting to really spiral in terms of just, I mean, we started to concoct just crazy theories, Lily, about who it could be, to the point of my uncle, my mother's brother, was murdered whenever I was about 6 months old, and so we actually concocted a theory that what if my biological father was my uncle's murderer?
Oh, wow.
Like, these are the things that, like, play tricks with your head, and that was about a week into this. And so it was a Friday night, and I texted my brother, and my mother lives close to him, about 6 hours away. And I texted him, and we had talked about getting together with my mother and asking her, like, it was going to be another month later. And I texted him and said, I can't deal with it anymore. I'm driving out tomorrow.
Uh-huh.
And so I got in my car that next day morning, and we drove out to essentially confront our mother with the news, and to try to get information. And the as everyone who experiences this knows, what this does to your understanding of your identity and who you are, and when you don't know, um, and there's just pure speculation. I think I very much believe it's a human right for all of us to know where we come from and who made us. And when you don't know that, it's I've always described as unmooring. And those 8 days, it was just completely unsettling for me, from that sort of high, jokish initial reaction to the settling in on what this really meant for me. And, so I drove out, and we went to meet with my mother, and we explained to her that, we had both taken this DNA test, and it showed that we were half brothers. And so essentially I said that, we took this DNA test, and, Mom, it shows that, that we're half brothers, and, we clearly know who Eric's father is, again, because he looked just like him. There's no doubt. And, would you like to elaborate? And so then I just kind of shut up, and my mother, in kind of classic ways, over the next 30 minutes would continue to either change the subject, or initially she kind of, she changed the subject, and then we kept coming back to the, you know, your children, your adult children are in front of you, saying that, saying what we're saying, and, we'd like, some answers. And she, laughed and said, "That's what you came out here for." And she really was not,
Mm.
was not coming around on this thing. And it was finally about 30 minutes into the conversation, and I was getting a little impatient. And finally, I can't remember what I said, but I said something where it was clear that, and my brother, who's a doctor, he said, "Mom, this is science. This is DNA. This doesn't, you know, DNA doesn't lie." He actually kind of got a little scientific with her a little bit, and so then the words came out of her mouth, a little bit under her breath, and she kind of looked down, and she said, "I always knew this day would come."
Mm.
And I knew at that point that we were going to get somewhere,
Mm-hmm.
but it still took another 15 minutes for her to start talking about anything substantive and to not change the subject and um, all of that. So after about 45 minutes, she told me his name. And let me go back a little bit to my journey here, and what I think other people would empathize with is I had decided when I was a young adult that I wanted to try to connect with who I thought was my father, and who I thought was my father passed away in 2002. About 6 months before he passed away, we'd actually moved close to where he lived, and my wife went with me one rainy afternoon where I actually drove out to his address, and I sat in his driveway or right on the street, trying to get up the courage to knock on his door. And because I just made a decision that I wanted to, he'd never been in my life. I just wanted, I had a feeling of wanting to connect with him, and I could not get out of the car. And 6 months later, he died, and died young, in his 50s. And it was heartbreaking for me. Um, and I went to his funeral, and his wife at the time, um, I just wanted to. I sat in the back of the room and I listened to people talk about him. My mother knew that I was going to his funeral. Um, I went and tried to kind of learn who he was, and subsequent years since then, we're in our faith, we're very interested in family history and genealogy and all of that. And I started doing a lot of work on my who I thought was my father's side of the family. And I guess the picture I'm trying to paint is there were multiple occasions where in my 20s and 30s and into my 40s where there would have been multiple appropriate times for her to have shared this information.
Yeah.
Um, and there's a um, uh, polycystic kidney disease that runs on that side of the family. My brother and I both had fear that we had that. I certainly had no reason to fear that because he wasn't my father, as it turns out. And she knew that we were stressed about that and worried about that. And, so there are all sorts of things like that and, that I still, I think, have to reconcile. So
Mm.
back to that day, she disclosed his name. And the interesting thing about when she did is, one, it took her a while to say his name. She talked about it, but she wouldn't disclose his name. And it was clear to me, and she said something to the effect of um, that he has a family and he's alive. And it was clear to me that she was protecting him. So, here I am, 45 years old. I don't know who my father is. It's clear he's alive. And, she's hesitating to tell me who it is, wanting to protect him. And I think that's something that I still struggle with just a little bit, even though it was momentary.
Yeah.
Um, and she did. Uh, I think the picture that it paints and where I have some sympathy for my mother is she never really dated again, and we never knew her. She never had any serious relationships, and it's clear to me that this was a man that she was the love of her life, um, and he was married with a family, and had 3 kids, and the two of them together decided that this was going to be a secret and that they weren't going to tell anyone, and they didn't. And my biological father knew uh, of me from the time that my mother was pregnant, And that's how they decided to handle it, was to keep it a secret. And then here I was, in front of her that day, and I think it's clear that, and she's told me as much, um, but he was the love of her life, and she couldn't, um, her marriage at the time that she got pregnant with me, they did divorce when I was about 9 months old. According to those that I trust, I think that knew of the situation, I don't think they were a very good match. They were married for about 5 years, and their marriage was ending. My biological father's marriage was not. And so they decided they were going to keep that a secret. As she told me was telling me his name, she used the phrase, the best policeman in town. That was a descriptor that's always been with me from the time I was a young boy. I remember her always referring to someone that was in her life as the best policeman in town. And not anyone that I ever met, but she would always talk about this person. And later, talking with my brother, I asked him, do you remember Mom talking about the best policeman in town? And he said, Travis, I've never heard that phrase before in my life. And so what's interesting to me is when she used that phrase to describe my father and how she always referred to him, is I remember her always talking to me about the best policeman in town. And in her own way, I think that was her way of dealing with the secret, is that she was, in her mind, telling me about him in some way without disclosing the secret. Um, so, so I think I thought it was interesting that she would have these separate conversations with me versus my brother about, someone that was that was in her life. So we left my mother's apartment, and we had dinner and continued to talk, and a little bit more about it. And immediately we found all sorts of information. My 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 father had a family, had 3 children. Um, he was a well-known, very reputable man in a small town. Had served as the chief of police, um, was the mayor at age 80. Multi-generation family from that same town, and was someone that it was easy for me to find information about him online. He'd been given a lot of local awards for community service and community leadership, this and that, and it was interesting.
Travis, so your biological father was literally the best policeman in town.
Was literally the best policeman in town. Yeah, wow. Yeah, he was the, and that's what is interesting about this, and I'll share a little bit more about getting to meet him and his family. But the interesting thing about it for me is, I, for whatever reason, he doesn't carry the same baggage in my mind for the secret and not being involved as what my mother does. And in spite of the fact that he knew I existed and never tried to intervene or help, my mother or us, growing up in some, pretty meager circumstances, I clearly, as I was looking up information about him, I could tell that things just kind of fell into place that made sense to me about why I am the way I am, and that I was a lot of who I am. I inherited from him, and it just became so clear to me. And so that day, I when I found out his name, the first thing on my list was I was not going to let. I mean, here this man is alive. He was 85 years old, and I was not going to let any time pass. And so I asked her to call him because I wanted to set up a time to meet him. And I was, so I kept saying, um, call John. And I could tell she was, she's not somebody that is kind of quick to action, I guess. And uh, on the drive back home that next day, I was pretty emphatic with her that, you need to call John. And so I'll talk about that just a little bit in just a minute. But she did, which kind of teed up the opportunity for me to call him. But within 24 hours, Lily, we had photographs. His his freshman high school yearbook, somebody has put online, and we found a photograph of him as a freshman in high school. And at that point, our third child was the same age, and we saw that picture, and my wife and I just gasped because it looked exactly like our son.
Oh, wow.
And like exactly like him. We texted, my wife's family. They knew that what was going on, and we just texted him a picture and said, who does this look like? And everybody knew, like, oh my gosh, that's Jackson.
Oh.
And and then we found another photograph online. I connected through I can't remember where I found it, but it was the most eerie, rewarding, all sorts of emotions rolled into one. But I found a picture of my grandfather, and I look exactly like him. I mean, it was so weird. And all of my life, everybody had been describing me that I look like mom, and my brother looks like dad. And what I come to find out is, I have fair skin and blonde hair and blue eyes, which my mother has, but we really don't look alike. I look like my grandfather. And the connection, I think a lot of people that go through this, when you see photographs and, when you don't know where you come from, in a lot of ways, just your identity kind of disappears. And seeing those photographs and seeing myself in photographs for the first time, it was absolutely, indescribable. So we found, so my father did not have a Facebook page, but one of my now new siblings passed away in 2007. So I have a brother and a sister still living, and they, have Facebook pages. And so, for the course of, a long period of time, just looking into their life and what they're doing, and seeing pictures of my father online. And, he was interviewed on TV, and I had a video clip of him, and all of that's because he kind of had some level of prominence in a small town. Just amazing the amount of information that I was able to find out about him. And so all of that was kind of rewarding, because all growing up, in some ways, I'd understood that I was from a family that kind of had a bad reputation, and that wasn't the case for me. And it made sense for why I am the way I am, and it just answered a lot of questions for me.
And have you met him?
So I have. So that same weekend, when my mother told me who he was, and I was very emphatic about her calling him, and she did, and so that he could be prepared for my phone call, and that it wouldn't be totally out of the blue or whatever. But so I called him. So I found out my NPE discovery on a Friday. And that following Saturday, 8 days later, is when I met with my mother and learned his name. And that following Wednesday after that, so less than 2 weeks, I called him on the phone and talked to my father for the first time. And I was very clear I wanted one thing out of that conversation. And all I wanted to do, I didn't really want to talk to him. I wanted to set a date and a time for us to meet in person. I wanted to learn about him and to really talk not on the phone but in person. For whatever reason, that was just the way I wanted to do it. And so we had a fairly brief conversation on the phone and determined a time that we could meet. And that following Monday, we met for dinner. And so that was 2 weeks and 3 days after learning my my NPE discovery. I was sitting across the table from my father. I walked in and he stood up. He was there first. He stood up and he greeted me and he grabbed my hand and he kind of pulled me over to sit down, and we had just a wonderful 90-minute conversation that was awkward, that was emotional, that was funny, that was all sorts of things all rolled into one. And here I thought my father was passed, and now here I was sitting across from my father and seeing a lot of me in him. It was one of the most remarkable, clearly one of the most remarkable experiences of my life. Through the course of that conversation, and I decided to record both the conversation with my mother when my brother and I confronted her, and my conversation with that first meeting with John. I wanted to record those conversations because I knew that there were going to be details in there that I would forget. I wasn't doing it from any kind of I was doing it for my own memory.
Yeah. Yeah.
Just to kind of be able to listen to it again and to make sure I had information straight. I didn't know if I was ever going to hear this information again.
What a great idea.
And yeah, I would recommend it I did not ask for permission in either case. I don't know what the law is in the state where I live. Yeah. But I did it. I just walked in with the phone, with the recorder on, and I just did it. So I would highly recommend that to anyone, because there's so many emotions rolled into this, and yeah, I know I would remember certain things, but I've gone back to listen to those things, and I highly recommend it.
Wow.
And we talked about a lot of things. I think it was gratifying for him to know that, the way I approached it was that, my life I was blessed. And I wanted the connection. And I did tell him that I was interested in meeting my new brother and sister. And though the conversation went very well, he made it clear that he wanted that he was fine for he and I to continue to meet and to talk. And I thought that was great, and I wanted to do that. But at that point, he did not want to talk to his family. He'd been married to his wife for over 50 years, and she had passed. At that point, this was 2018, so she passed about 7 years before, and but no one knew about me or my existence, and that was the way he wanted it to be, for that period of time. We proceeded to have dinner about 6 or 7 times over the course of about 9 months. Good conversations, and we tell each other about ourselves a little bit, and he continued to kind of build some trust in me. And finally, last May, I confronted him a little bit more pointedly and asked him to introduce me to his kids and to my brother and sister. I told him that I recognized that what I was asking of him and that it wasn't a small thing. I have empathy for that, and but that I told him that I thought that it would bring his life to kind of full circle, and that I thought it would. I really was just honest with him. I said that I think this will be, allow you to kind of complete a circle for your life, and I think it's important for you, and I know it's important for me. And we ended up. So he said he wanted to think about it, and I said I would give him that time. And we talked again a couple of months later as I was giving him some time to think about it. And I finally talked to him, and I said, you really have four choices here, John, and talking with your family. And I was trying not to pressure him too much, but I was not going to continue going through my life knowing I have a brother and a sister that don't know about me. And so I was, just kind of walked him through, and I said, John, there's four ways this can go down. I said, you can tell this story yourself, and you can, talk to your kids and tell them about me, or I can, and they can learn it that way, or I can ignore your wishes and I can just contact them myself, or I can honor your wishes and I can wait until you've passed, and then I can show up in their life. Or one of the things I said the very first time we met is I said, John, at some point, someone is going to take this test that is going to know that I don't fit in being a close relative. And so that was the fourth thing I said. I said, or John, somebody's going to take this thing. And I said, there's only one of those four scenarios that allows you to be able to tell your story the way you want to, in full context, in your time, without someone coming to you. And I could tell the next time we talked after that he was going to do it. He was just looking for the right time. In the meantime, someone did take the test that reached out to me and said, I can't figure out how we're related.
Oh, funny.
And so it did kind of happen that way a little bit. And I ended up talking to her on the phone. I asked her if I could could call and talk with her, and she said yes. And so we talked, and I told her everything. And it turns out that she's a first cousin once removed, so she's the daughter of a first cousin. And so I told her that I had been meeting with him, and that I felt like it would be best for the family if they learned it from him, and I felt like that was really going to happen, and asked her if she could respect that, and she we had a great conversation, and she's turned out to, I've not met her in person yet, and I can't wait to, but she really was a lifeline for me for about 6 weeks from the time she and I connected until my father talked with his family. And it was really great because at first I was asking her to keep this in confidence until he could talk with his family. And by getting closer to the end of those 6 weeks, it was a little more like she was kind of talking me off the ledge, because I was like, I was trying to push her forward at that point because I wasn't sure if he was ever really going to find this supposed right time. But but he did. And so on Labor Day, this last Labor Day, he got his family together, and he told them. And that same night, like I said, they're all from the same small town. All their kids still live there. So his grandchildren all live there. And so my brother and sister got all of their family together that same night on Labor Day and told them. And I found out about that from this cousin who told me that next day that my brother and sister got their family together and told them. And I can't tell you how gratifying that, like what that did. I was in my office at work when she texted me that, and I just cried because I wasn't a secret anymore. And so much of the emotions that go through this is part of it is, um, being a secret is just not, you know, um, not okay. And so knowing that, not only did my father finally share with his family, but I didn't know how they were going to react. And the fact that they disclosed to their family immediately said a lot to me about who they are, the kind of people that they are, and the kind of reception that I was going to get. So about 2 weeks later, we found a time to get together. And so we planned a time. My wife and I went to my father's home, and I met my brother and his wife and my sister, um, and they're in my father's living room. And I walked through the door, and I've been a lifelong St. Louis Cardinals fan, and my father actually is a lifelong St. Louis Cardinals fan. And I learned through social media that my brother was a Cincinnati Reds fan, and I wore a Cardinals shirt sort of intentionally to sort of break the ice. And I walked in, and he immediately reacted to that and kind of laughed, and we kind of bantered about that for just a minute. And I told him this was 13 months after I had learned who they were, and I kind of, again, back to the kind of using humor to diffuse awkwardness a little bit, is one of the first things that came out of my mouth was I said, I've been stalking you people for 13 months on social media. Um, and and we all just kind of laughed, and we sat in that living room for about 2 or 3 hours, and I saw family photographs, and we talked, and they showed me some additional photographs of my grandfather that I look a lot like, and they handed me a collage that they had put together of some pictures that they had found of me online and my grandfather, and put them side by side into a collage, and they handed it to me along with another picture of my grandfather that I hadn't seen, and I just cried.
That is so sweet.
So that evening, my brother invited my wife and I to go out to dinner he and his wife were meeting with some friends, and he introduced me to two of his close friends and told them the situation. And, what that did for me, Lily, again, back to what makes these situations so emotionally challenging is being a secret. And immediately I wasn't a secret anymore, and someone wasn't trying to hide me. And they were a prominent family. Everybody knows my brother's on the city council. My father was the mayor. In the time since then, I know from immediately that they're still having a hard time with the understanding that their father cheated on their mother.
Sure.
We've met since a few times, and I think they have a sense for how I grew up and some of the challenges there, and I think they're still kind of dealing with that, which I empathize with and understand. And I just come back down to I've continued to meet with my father separately, and my brother and sister and I we are my new brother and sister and I are planning a get together again in a month. All of that is still being worked out, and everybody's kind of figuring out how to deal with it. But at the end of the day, they've been as welcoming as I think you can expect. This is all. I'm 18 months into this revelation. They're only about 5 months into this revelation and still dealing with it. And I give them a lot of credit for how they've handled it. And all I know is I have a brother and a sister that I didn't know, and I know enough, just kind of gut reaction, that a lot of who I am comes from that genetic connection. And I mentioned that I learned of my NPE status 1 year to the day after we moved. we moved to the same state where they live. And I've lived out west most of my adult life. And now we've moved to the Midwest, to the same state where they are, and they live 2 hours down the road.
Wow.
And I don't consider that a coincidence. And I think, my faith plays into how this is all played out. And as much as I still have a hard time with, I should have known about this sooner. My mother should have, shared this with me sometime between the ages of, in my mind, sometime between the ages of 16 and 25. I give some latitude, I guess, to being a secret and not wanting to break up a family. I'm not saying that's right, but I understand it. But in spite of that fact and I still am dealing with that with my mother of that whole situation, and so many people that have kind of their stories with their mother. I share a lot of those that, I still think that maybe she feels judged for her actions, and that's not it at all for me. It's the not knowing who my father was, and her having all these opportunities to share with me where it could have helped me to know who I am and understand more about me. And that's what I have a problem with. And her not even, the first 4 days where I knew, she never reached out to say, how are you? Or it was all about kind of her side of this. And that said, I think that there's a divine part of this for me that doesn't seem accidental. I've gotten a lot out of hearing other people share their stories, and I'm glad that you have this podcast. I think it's important for us to, as I said, everyone's circumstances are different, and I've had this wonderful, beautiful outcome so far, and everyone's not that lucky, and I understand that. There's so many common threads that run through this. I think others just kind of knowing the struggle and the emotional challenges with identity and secrets and I think is helpful for all of us to learn and to grow and to understand our situation. And so I really appreciate you doing it.
Yeah, absolutely.
When we were in my father's living room, when I met my brother and sister for the first time, it's indescribable, the feeling of looking at my father and seeing the burden lifted off of his shoulders of us being together and having that conversation and it not being a secret for him anymore. The tears in his eyes and just the clear burden lifted off of his shoulders was so evident, and that makes me so happy because I forgive all of that with him, and that helped me a lot in my own journey through this to see that burden lifted off of his shoulders, and to hug him and to feel that burden lifted off his shoulders. That was such a wonderful outcome that day for me, in addition to meeting my brother and sister and that whole transformational aspect of it. I was so happy for my father.
Wow. You've really had some blessings come out of this, and I'm happy for you.
Thank you.
Thanks again to Travis for sharing today. These stories are here for us to identify with. If you are an NPE that would like to share your story, email npestories@gmail.com. You do not have to give any identifying information. If you are an NPE and would like to share your story, I'd like to hear from you. Subscribe to this podcast to hear more. Come heal with us.